Sergio Leone informed Clint Eastwood that he was merely part of the backdrop, and that Leone was the one who created stars. He subjected Eastwood to appalling working conditions and deliberately refused to have his costume cleaned throughout the entire filming process. When the film ultimately transformed Eastwood into a legendary figure, his eventual response to Leone would become a defining moment in cinema history. Clint Eastwood stood in the unforgiving Spanish desert, dressed in a poncho that emanated an overwhelming stench of deterioration and rot, while an Italian director communicated through an interpreter, explaining in meticulous detail why Clint was fundamentally mistaken about virtually everything related to the production. Sergio Leone had selected Clint for the lead role in A Fistful of Dollars, only after numerous more prominent actors had declined the opportunity for a variety of professional and financial considerations. Charles Bronson had no interest in working for inadequate compensation in Spain. Henry Fonda had passed on the project entirely. James Coburn had demanded a salary that far exceeded what the production budget could accommodate. Clint represented Leone's fourth, or perhaps fifth, alternative, an actor primarily known for television work in America who was prepared to accept minimal pay in exchange for an opportunity at achieving success in motion pictures and gaining international recognition. However, Leone established from the very beginning of production that he held no particular admiration or respect for his leading performer. In Leone's perspective, the director embodied the role of artist, the auteur, the singular creative authority behind a film. Actors, by contrast, were simply instruments, interchangeable components that moved according to his instructions and delivered the dialogue exactly as he specified. Leone communicated through his translator on the initial day of filming that Clint was simply the tall individual, that Leone was the one who manufactured stars, and that Clint's sole responsibility was to follow the directions provided to him. Clint had previously collaborated with challenging directors throughout his career, but Leone functioned on an entirely different plane of difficult behavior. He treated his principal actor as though he were merely an extra who happened to occupy more time on screen than others. Whenever Clint attempted to offer suggestions regarding his character's development or insights about a particular scene, Leone would dismiss him with a wave of his hand, displaying obvious disinterest. Leone would respond negatively, often without even making eye contact with Clint, informing him that he lacked understanding of cinema itself. He would emphasize that Clint comprehended television production, but that this was art, that Leone himself was the artist, and that Clint was nothing more than the paint used to create the artwork. The conditions under which they were working proved to be extraordinarily harsh and demanding. The production was taking place in Almeria, Spain, specifically in the Tabernas Desert region, where the temperatures consistently reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The film's budget was minuscule when compared to standard Hollywood production expenditures, totaling approximately $200,000 for the complete film. The crew was minimal in size. The equipment was outdated and obsolete, and the shooting schedule was relentlessly punishing for everyone involved. Despite these universal hardships, Leone reserved his absolute worst treatment specifically for Clint. While the Italian actors received relatively comfortable living accommodations and were granted regular breaks from filming, Clint was required to spend countless hours standing in the scorching sun while wearing multiple layers of clothing, including a shirt, vest, and poncho that effectively trapped heat against his body, making the experience even more unbearable. Then there existed the matter of the costume itself, which would eventually become legendary in the annals of film history. The poncho that would transform into an iconic symbol, instantly recognizable to millions of people across the globe for many decades into the future, was deliberately never washed or cleaned. Not a single time. Not throughout the entire 6-week shooting period of the first film, not during the production of the second film, and not during the making of the third film either. Leone maintained with absolute insistence that the poncho appeared superior when it was dirty, claiming it looked more authentic and more genuinely lived in by the character. He categorically refused to permit the wardrobe department to clean it between different productions or even between individual shooting days. By the time production reached the third film in the series, the poncho had become so thoroughly filthy and contaminated that it could practically maintain an upright position independently. The odor emanating from it was absolutely intolerable. The smell represented a concentrated mixture of accumulated sweat, desert dust, cigar smoke, and Spanish desert sand that had been ground deeply into every individual fiber of the fabric. Leone gestured at the filthy, sweat-stained poncho with unmistakable satisfaction, declaring that it possessed character at this stage, that it had accumulated history, that it communicated a story to the audience. He argued that this quality made it authentic and real. He suggested that American studios would launder it daily, and it would consequently appear artificial and fake, whereas this version appeared genuinely lived in, appearing as though it belonged to a man who had killed others. He posed the question to Clint whether he desired to create something comparable to Disney productions or whether he wanted to create genuine art. Clint pointed out the reasonable concern that the garment also possessed an unbearable stench and was beginning to cultivate biological growth within its folds and creases. Leone responded with a dismissive shrug, asking rhetorically whether Clint desired to become a movie star, stating that this was the price that had to be paid, and simply instructing him to wear the costume. The cigar that Clint smoked while performing his iconic squinting expression was originally Leone's concept, though it didn't emerge from any spirit of creative collaboration between director and actor. Leone required something to obscure and cover the lower portion of Clint's face because he had decided that Clint's mouth moved incorrectly when he delivered dialogue. The squinting expression was partially Clint's own choice, a practical necessity to see anything clearly in the brutal desert sunlight, but Leone subsequently claimed credit for this element as well, characterizing it as part of his directorial vision and creative genius. Leone also steadfastly refused to address Clint by his actual name while on the set. He consistently referred to him as the tall guy or the cowboy, or would simply point in Clint's direction and snap his fingers when he required Clint to move into position for a shot. Through his translator, Leone would shout directions in a harsh manner, instructing the tall guy to stand in a specific location, ordering him not to move from that spot, telling him not to think, but merely to stand exactly where positioned. When Clint attempted to initiate a discussion about his character's underlying motivation for a particular scene, Leone laughed directly in his face with obvious contempt. He questioned what motivation could possibly be relevant, stating that this was a Western film, not a production based on Stanislavski's method acting techniques. He told Clint that his job was to look mysterious, to shoot the gun when required, and to ride the horse when necessary, questioning what possible motivation could be needed beyond these basic requirements. Clint responded patiently that he was attempting to comprehend who this character fundamentally was as a person, questioning what internal forces drove him, and why he took the actions depicted in the script. Leone interrupted him abruptly, asserting that he himself drove the character because he was the director. He declared that he informed Clint what the character does in each scene, that Clint's responsibility was to execute those actions, and that nothing beyond this was required or desired. The other actors involved in the production, who were predominantly Italian and Spanish, proved more compliant and accepting of Leone's dictatorial approach to directing. They had been trained and conditioned to work with directors who treated actors essentially as puppets to be manipulated. However, Clint was American, educated, and trained within a distinctly different theatrical and cinematic tradition where actors were expected to collaborate meaningfully with directors in the creative process. This fundamental clash of approaches and expectations created persistent tension throughout the production. Leone would inform the crew members loudly enough to ensure that Clint could overhear his comments, stating that in America, filmmakers mistakenly believed that actors held importance and granted them excessive power. He asserted that this was the fundamental reason why American films had become garbage in recent years, that actors who considered themselves important produced terrible results. However, despite Leone's consistently dismissive treatment, despite the brutal and punishing conditions, despite the unwashed costume and the obvious contempt directed at him, Clint accomplished something truly remarkable during the production. He successfully created an iconic character that would resonate across generations. The Man with No Name emerged not from Leone's direction or vision, but rather from Clint's own creative choices and instincts. The remarkable economy of movement, the quiet but powerful intensity, the manner in which violence would suddenly explode from complete stillness, represented choices that Clint made independently. Everything that Leone actively criticized about Clint's acting approach ultimately became the character's greatest strengths and most memorable qualities. The television actor who supposedly didn't understand the language of cinema was in the process of creating something revolutionary that would fundamentally transform the Western genre. Leone failed to recognize or appreciate what was happening before his eyes. Throughout the filming process, he complained constantly about Clint's performance, characterizing it as excessively still, excessively quiet, essentially nothing of substance. He would compare Clint unfavorably to Italian actors, claiming they possessed passion, while Clint resembled a wooden board. When filming finally concluded, Leone remained thoroughly convinced that he had created an absolute masterpiece through his direction, his unique vision, and his genius. In his mind, the actor had been completely incidental to the film's quality. He informed the crew members that he could have placed anyone in that poncho and achieved the same results, that the director makes the film and that the camera creates the star, rather than any inherent quality of the performer. Then A Fistful of Dollars received its release in Italy. The film became an immediate cultural phenomenon. It revitalized and reinvigorated the entire Western genre, launched what would become known as the spaghetti Western movement, and generated enormous profits from an extremely modest budget. More significantly for the parties involved, it transformed Clint Eastwood into an international star of the first magnitude. Audiences emerging from theaters didn't discuss or celebrate Leone's directorial techniques. Instead, they talked obsessively about the man with no name. They discussed the memorable squint, the distinctive poncho, the quiet but palpable sense of menace that the character projected. They talked about Clint Eastwood as a compelling screen presence. Leone reacted to this response with fury and resentment. In interviews with journalists, he attempted to claim exclusive credit for Clint's entire performance. He told Italian newspapers that he had created that character from nothing, that he had instructed Clint regarding every movement and every facial expression. He insisted that without his direction and guidance, Clint would amount to nothing more than just a tall American who fundamentally could not act with any genuine skill. The audience categorically disagreed with Leone's assessment. They demanded more films featuring the man with no name. They specifically wanted more of Clint Eastwood in this role. Leone, recognizing the enormous financial opportunity that existed, even though it wounded his considerable ego, signed Clint to contracts for 2 additional films, For a Few Dollars More, which would be produced in 1965, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, scheduled for 1966. However, his treatment of Clint throughout these subsequent productions didn't improve in any meaningful way. If anything, his behavior and attitude deteriorated further and became even worse than before. During the filming of For a Few Dollars More, Leone's contempt for his star became increasingly public and undisguised. He granted interviews to publications in which he characterized Clint as adequate and serviceable in the role, but persistently insisted that the film's critical and commercial success derived entirely from Leone's revolutionary approach to direction. He proclaimed himself the auteur, declaring that the actor represented merely one element of the production, comparable in importance to the horse or the gun used as props. For the production of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Leone insisted that Clint wear the identical poncho from the first film, which remained unwashed and had now become filthy beyond any reasonable description after being used across 3 separate productions. When Clint raised objections to this requirement, Leone dismissed his concerns entirely, arguing that the garment had become iconic by this point and that the audience maintained expectations of seeing it. He simply ordered Clint to wear it without further discussion. Clint complied with the demand and wore the disgusting costume, but resentment had been steadily building within him throughout this process. He had endured 3 complete films of being treated as though he were merely a prop or piece of equipment. 3 films during which Leone claimed all credit for the success. 3 films of being referred to as the tall guy, and being told repeatedly that he lacked acting ability. By the time production concluded on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Clint had evolved into an international phenomenon of unprecedented magnitude. The trilogy of films had established him as the biggest star throughout Europe. American distribution companies were competing intensely to acquire the films for theatrical release. Hollywood studios and producers were taking serious notice of his talent and box office appeal. Leone was simultaneously planning an elaborate and grand premiere event for the final film. The premiere was scheduled for December 23rd in Rome during 1966. The event was designed to be a major occasion in the entertainment calendar. Politicians, celebrities from various fields, and international press representatives would all be in attendance. Leone perceived and conceptualized this event as his personal coronation, the definitive moment when his genius would receive worldwide recognition and acknowledgement. Clint received an invitation to attend, which was inevitable given that he was the star of the film. However, Leone made abundantly clear through his representatives and assistants that this evening belonged to Leone exclusively. Leone's assistant communicated directly to Clint that the director would be the one speaking about the artistry of the film, and that while Clint's presence at the event was appreciated, Sergio would be presenting the film to the audience and press. Clint said absolutely nothing in response to this information. He simply smiled very slightly, displaying that same subtle smile that the man with no name characteristically used in the films immediately before someone met their death. The premiere event itself proved to be a spectacular affair. The theater was filled completely with Rome's elite members of society and the entertainment industry. Leone was thoroughly in his element, holding court among the attendees, graciously accepting congratulations from admirers, and basking in the attention and adulation being directed toward him. Clint stood quietly off to the side of the main activity, simply observing everything that was unfolding. When the film concluded its screening, the applause from the audience was absolutely thunderous. The audience members clearly loved what they had witnessed. It was immediately obvious to everyone present that this would be the biggest and most successful film in the entire trilogy, a genuine masterpiece of action filmmaking and storytelling craft. Leone ascended to the stage with a beaming expression of satisfaction and pride. He commenced his speech in Italian, which was subsequently translated for the international guests in attendance. He began by declaring that tonight the audience had witnessed his vision brought to life on screen. For 3 films, he had created an entirely new kind of Western that had never existed before. He proclaimed that he had revolutionized cinema itself. He stated that this character, this mysterious man, had emerged entirely from his imagination, his direction, and his camera work. He continued speaking for several additional minutes, never once mentioning Clint's name or acknowledging his contribution. He discussed extensively his own choices as a filmmaker, his innovations in technique, and his genius as an artist. The actor who played the central role received mention only as my instrument and the vehicle for my vision, without any personal recognition. The audience applauded politely in response to Leone's speech, but there developed a growing murmur of confusion and discomfort spreading through the crowd. People began questioning where Clint was and why the star of the film wasn't being properly acknowledged for his work. Finally, the master of ceremonies, perceiving the awkwardness of the situation, suggested that perhaps they could now hear some words from Signor Eastwood. Leone's face visibly tightened with displeasure. This deviation wasn't part of his carefully planned program, but the audience was already applauding enthusiastically, and Clint was walking deliberately toward the stage. Clint accepted the microphone from the master of ceremonies. He stood silently for a moment, looking first at Leone and then turning his attention to the audience. When he finally spoke, his voice maintained that quiet quality, but remained clear and penetrating. That same raspy whisper that Leone had mocked and ridiculed throughout 3 films of production. Clint began by expressing his thanks and stating that he wanted to thank Sergio Leone for these 3 films they had made together. Leone smiled at this opening, interpreting it as a concession and an acknowledgement of his supremacy and importance. Clint continued by saying that Sergio had taught him something genuinely important through their working relationship. He had taught Clint that you don't need a director who respects you in order to create something powerful and meaningful. You don't require someone who knows your name or values your contribution. Sometimes the very best work emerges from the process of proving someone wrong about their assessment of you. The audience fell into complete silence. This clearly wasn't conforming to the pattern of a typical thank you speech from an appreciative actor. Clint continued, explaining that for 3 films, Sergio had told him repeatedly that he couldn't act with any competence. His voice never increased in volume, but somehow managed to fill the entire theater space. Leone had informed him that he was just background, merely a tall guy who followed directions obediently. He had told Clint that he understood television production, but not cinema, that he was essentially a wooden board lacking any passion or depth as a performer. He had forced Clint to wear the same unwashed costume throughout all 3 films because, in Leone's own words, the actor is comparable to the horse, merely a tool that doesn't require comfort, but only requires direction. Leone's face had transformed, becoming visibly pale. This scenario was not supposed to be happening. This was his night, his triumph, his moment of glory. This American television actor was supposed to be grateful, humble, and deferential in his remarks. Clint pressed forward, stating that here's what Sergio hadn't understood throughout this entire process. His eyes remained locked on the director as he spoke. The reason audiences attended these films wasn't the direction itself. It wasn't the camera angles or the zoom shots or the artistic vision of the director. It was the character that drew them. It was the man with no name. And that character existed and resonated with audiences because Clint had created him despite the director's approach, not because of the director's guidance. The audience had become completely silent at this point. International press representatives were scribbling frantically in their notebooks, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Clint continued his speech, explaining that every single choice that Sergio had criticized during production had become exactly what people loved about the performance. The stillness that Leone had called boring, the quietness he had characterized as weak, the economy of movement he had dismissed as lazy. Clint stated clearly that he had built this character in opposition to Leone's vision, not from following it. Clint then turned directly toward Leone, who remained standing frozen at the edge of the stage, unable to respond or intervene. He addressed Leone directly, reminding him that he had told Clint that he made the stars. But Leone had been fundamentally wrong in that assertion. Leone hadn't made Clint a star through his directorial choices. Clint had become a star specifically by doing the opposite of what Leone wanted him to do. He declared that the success of these films wasn't because of Leone's direction, but rather despite it. The audience began to stir with visible reactions, some people gasping audibly, others starting to whisper among themselves. This represented something unprecedented in their experience. A major star was publicly destroying his director's reputation at what was supposed to be a celebratory premiere event. Clint concluded by thanking Sergio for showing him that he could and should trust his own instincts over someone else's ego and arrogance. He thanked him for the terrible treatment because it had motivated him to work harder and prove himself. He thanked him for taking all the credit throughout the process because it had shown Clint exactly who he never wanted to become as a filmmaker himself. Clint set the microphone down and walked off the stage, leaving Leone standing completely alone, thoroughly humiliated in front of Rome's elite society and the assembled international press corps. The room erupted into chaos. Some audience members applauded Clint's brutal honesty and courage, while others sat shocked by the public confrontation they had just witnessed. But absolutely everyone present was talking intensely about what had just transpired before their eyes. Leone attempted to recover his composure and deliver another speech, trying to dismiss Clint's words as American arrogance and a failure to understand Italian artistry and film culture. However, the damage had been inflicted and was irreversible. The story spread rapidly through international media outlets. Clint Eastwood had systematically destroyed Sergio Leone at Leone's own premiere celebration. The films continued to achieve massive worldwide success, earning millions of dollars and permanently changing cinema. Clint evolved into one of the biggest stars on the entire planet, commanding enormous salaries and creative control over his projects. Leone continued making films afterward, including the critically acclaimed Once Upon a Time in the West, but his reputation remained permanently marked and tarnished by Clint's devastating speech. Every article written about Leone included mention of his difficult and contentious relationship with his most famous star. Every interview inevitably included questions about Clint's public accusations. Every retrospective analysis of his career had to address and discuss the premiere confrontation. Leone and Clint never collaborated on another project together. Leone attempted to dismiss the incident in subsequent interviews, characterizing Clint as ungrateful and claiming he didn't understand true artistry. But the facts remained undeniable and clear. Clint's career had skyrocketed to unprecedented heights. Leone's career had essentially stalled in comparison. Years later, shortly before Leone's death, which occurred in 1989, he was asked by an interviewer about Clint Eastwood. His response proved telling and perhaps represented a grudging acknowledgement. He stated that Clint had become a great director in his own right, and that perhaps Clint had learned something valuable from him after all. However, those individuals who had been present at that premiere in 1966 understood the actual truth of the situation. Clint had learned precisely what kind of director never to become through his experience with Leone. His revenge against Leone didn't take the form of violence or legal action. Instead, it manifested as success of a massive and undeniable nature that conclusively proved everything Leone had said about him was fundamentally wrong. The unwashed poncho that Leone had forced Clint to wear throughout 3 films now hangs preserved in a museum as one of the most iconic costumes in the entire history of cinema. Nobody particularly remembers or celebrates Leone's camera angles or technical innovations. Everybody remembers and continues to discuss the man with no name that Clint created.